In 1910, Pablo Picasso walked into the Trocadero Museum in Paris, saw African masks for the first time, and said, in his own words, they were against everything, against unknown, threatening spirits. They were weapons. They helped me to understand. He went home and immediately began working on Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, the painting that launched Cubism and changed Western art forever. Pablo Picasso did not invent Cubism. He discovered it in an African mask. And the masks were not made as art. They were made as power. Today we ask the question that should have been asked 100 years ago. What is African art known for? The real answer, not the gallery placard version, not the primitive art version, but the full, documented, extraordinary truth. Then, this is going to change the way you see every piece of art you've ever looked at. Let's begin. This is not a conspiracy theory. It is documented art history. Picasso visited the Ethnographic Museum at the Trocadero in 1907. He was deeply disturbed and energized by what he saw. He said, "I understood why I was a painter, all alone in that awful museum, with masks, dolls made by the red men, dusty mannequins. Les Demoiselles d'Avignon must have come to me that very day, but not at all because of the forms, because it was my first exorcism painting." The masks he saw were primarily from Congo and Côte d'Ivoire, objects that had been removed, often by force, from their communities of origin. Art history has a name for this problem: primitivism. That is the term under which African, oceanic, and indigenous art was grouped when Western modernists began studying it. Primitive, as in pre-modern, as in not art. This framing allowed the formal vocabulary of African sculpture to be extracted and reconstituted as Western modernism, without the need to credit the source. Because if the source is primitive, not real art, then there is no theft. The framing was not accidental. It was useful. Viral moment. Picasso's Les Demoiselles d'Avignon sold for nothing. He kept it. But when it was auctioned after his death, pieces from his collection, including African objects he owned, went for millions. The African artists who made the original language received nothing. Their communities received nothing. Their objects are still in European museums. Before we continue, it is important to understand the mission behind Griot Wave Academy. This platform was created to preserve knowledge, culture, music, and stories that often go unheard or are forgotten. Griot Wave is not just about content. It is about building independent systems of learning, creativity, and empowerment. Through books, audio, technology, and media, the goal is to transform timeless wisdom into practical tools for today's generation and future generations. The most important thing to understand about African art is that the category itself, art, is insufficient. The Western concept of art as a separate domain from religion, politics, and science was invented in Renaissance Europe and does not translate cleanly to most African visual traditions. When we say African art, we are actually talking about sacred objects, political documents, philosophical texts, ecological knowledge systems, and communication tools. Some of them are aesthetically extraordinary. All of them are functionally complex. On art as telephone, when an Akan Kente cloth is woven, each strip carries a specific pattern that functions as a proverb or a historical reference. When you wear that cloth to a ceremony, you are making a speech in fabric. You are saying specific things to specific people, using a visual language they know how to read. This is not metaphor. This is the actual function of the object. A kente cloth is a diplomatic document, a family history, and a fashion statement simultaneously. There is no Western art concept that encompasses all of that at once. On Nkisi. The Congo Nkisi power object is perhaps the most sophisticated example. The Nkisi is assembled over time by a specialist, Nganga, who adds medicinal and symbolic materials. Iron nails, mirrors, shells, organic matter, each of which contributes specific power to the object. The nails are not decorative. They are activated by the Nganga through ritual, and each nail represents a contract, a healing, or a resolution of conflict. When the Nkisi was first brought to European museums in the 19th century, curators described it as, quote, barbaric fetishism. It was actually a pharmacological, juridical, and spiritual archive simultaneously. On Blombos, let me give you a single fact that should permanently reorder your understanding of art history. The oldest known abstract art in the world was made in South Africa 73,000 years ago. The oldest known European cave art, Chauvet Cave in France, is 36,000 years old. That means the African art tradition is 37,000 years older than the European cave painting tradition, that gets celebrated as the, quote, birth of art. The birth of art happened in Africa. The European tradition that followed was itself an export. On sandrock art. The sandrock art tradition is extraordinary, not just for its age but for its content. Art historians and anthropologists spent decades trying to decode sandrock paintings. For a long time, they were described as hunting magic, images of animals made to ensure successful hunts. Then, in the 1980s, David Lewis Williams at the University of the Witwatersrand did something radical. He actually asked sand people what the images meant. They told him. The human-animal hybrids, the figures in strange postures, the zigzag lines. These are images of the healing trance ceremony. The artists were painting what they saw, while in an altered state of consciousness during their N/Om healing dance. The images are a visual neuroscience experiment conducted over 30,000 years. Nobody asked the sand people for 100 years, because Europeans assumed that primitive people couldn't have a complex explanation for their own art. On Nok, the Nok terracotta heads are one of the great mysteries of African art history. Who made them? Why? We know they were made between 1500 BCE and 500 CE in what is now central Nigeria. We know they are technically sophisticated, hollow-built, with deliberate stylistic conventions for representing facial features. We do not know their function. This is not a failure of African civilization. It is a success of scholarly honesty. We do not know what they meant, and we should say so, rather than inventing a story that fits a preconceived narrative. The single most important thing to understand about African art is this. The question, is it beautiful, was never the primary question. The primary question was always, does it work? Works as what? As a communication tool, as a spiritual vehicle, as a political document, as an ecological record, as a healing technology. This does not mean African art is not beautiful. The extraordinary beauty of Benin bronzes, of sand rock art, of kente cloth, is undeniable. But beauty was not the objective. Beauty was the result of making something that worked with skill and intention. This is a completely different relationship to aesthetics than the Western fine arts tradition, and it produces completely different kinds of objects. Nkisi nail figures specifically. When the first Nkisi nail figures arrived in European collections in the 19th century, they were described as fetishes, objects of superstition. Art historians later began describing them as, quote, power figures. Both descriptions miss the point. The most accurate description is a juridical archive in sculptural form. Each nail represents a specific social act, a dispute resolved, an oath sworn, a healing completed. The figure without nails is an unactivated vessel. The figure covered in nails is a community's living legal history. When you understand this, you understand that the sculptor who made the figure and the Nganga who activated it were engaged in one of the most sophisticated information management systems ever developed, and it looked like a wooden figure covered in nails. February 1897. British forces surround and burn Benin City, capital of one of the most sophisticated kingdoms in West Africa. Their stated justification: revenge for an ambush that killed British soldiers. Their actual objective: to break Benin's control of the palm oil trade. What they found in the royal palace exceeded anything they had expected. On the technical mastery. When the first Benin bronzes reached Europe, scholars immediately tried to deny that Africans had made them. They suggested Portuguese craftsmen, Egyptian influence, anything except the obvious truth: that Benin metalworkers had developed, independently, a lost wax casting technique of extraordinary sophistication. The formal portraits of kings, the narrative plaques documenting court events, the intricate ivory carvings, all of this represented a royal art tradition that had been developing since the 13th century. The Benin Smith Guild, the Igun Erenwan, is one of the longest-running artistic institutions in human history. The knowledge of how to make bronzes has been passed from father to son in this guild for 700 years. The guild still exists. They are still making bronzes. In Benin City, today, on the British Museum. The British Museum currently holds approximately 900 Benin bronzes. This is the largest single collection outside Nigeria. When the German government announced in 2021 that it would return its bronzes, the British Museum's director released a statement arguing that the objects were, quote, better cared for in London, that they served a quote, universal public, and that context was important. The context he failed to mention is that the context in which the objects were most completely understood by the Igun Erenwan Guild, by Benin royal court historians, by the Oba of Benin, exists in Benin City, not in Bloomsbury. African masks are the most widely recognized and the most widely misunderstood African art form in the world. They appear in every discussion of, quote, primitive art, every anthropology textbook, every world cultures curriculum. And in almost all of those contexts, they are fundamentally misrepresented. The key misunderstanding: a mask is not a costume. In most African masquerade traditions, the mask does not cover the face of a person who is playing a character. The mask is the character. Or more accurately, the mask is the spirit or ancestor or force that the character embodies. When the mask is worn and the ceremony begins, the person who puts it on has disappeared. They are no longer there. What you are encountering is the ancestor, the spirit, the force, made visible and present through the transformation technology of the mask. On the Fang connection to Picasso. The white painted Fang faces, particularly the reliquary guardian heads, are the specific aesthetic vocabulary that most directly shaped Picasso's revolutionary break in 1907. The elongated oval face, the flat geometric planes, the reduced and abstracted features. Picasso saw these and immediately understood something about representing three-dimensional reality on a two-dimensional surface. The Fang artists who developed this aesthetic were solving a specific problem: how to represent an ancestor guardian who exists between the world of the living and the world of the dead. The liminal, between-worlds quality of the face required a visual language that was not naturalistic. Picasso borrowed the visual language without understanding or acknowledging the philosophical problem it was designed to solve. Drop the name of any African mask you've encountered before, in a museum, in a book, anywhere. Let's see what people know going into this video. On kente specifically, let me describe what kente actually is, because the word has been appropriated into American black culture as a general symbol of African identity, which has both empowered and slightly decontextualized it. Kente is produced on narrow-band looms by Akan weavers, historically male specialists. The cloth is woven in strips of approximately 4 inches wide, then sewn together. The most expensive kente is woven in silk. Each strip carries a repeating pattern, and each pattern has a name, usually a proverb or a historical reference. Oyokumin Adwaneasa means, "My skill is exhausted," worn by a master artisan demonstrating their fullest competence. Ima Da means, "It has not happened before," worn to mark unprecedented events. When Kwame Nkrumah wore kente to address the United Nations General Assembly in 1960, in the year of African independence, he was not making a fashion statement. He was delivering a speech in fabric to every Akan person watching. The message: we bring our own civilization to this institution. We come as ourselves. On Bogolan, the chemical process behind mud cloth is extraordinary. Fresh cotton cloth is painted with a solution made from boiled leaves, which mordants the fabric. Then fermented mud, collected from riverbeds and left to ferment for a year, is painted over the mordanted areas. The mud's iron oxide chemically reacts with the leaf mordant to create marks that will not fade. Ever. Some Bambara mud cloth patterns in museum collections from the early 20th century are as sharp as the day they were made. Adinkra is one of the most beautiful intellectual systems ever created. Over 100 visual symbols, each representing a complete philosophical concept. Entire ethical systems, cosmological principles, and governance philosophies compressed into single geometric images. On Sankofa. Sankofa is the symbol that makes me most proud to be connected to African intellectual tradition. The Sankofa bird flies forward, looking backward, holding an egg in its mouth. It says, "You cannot know where you are going if you do not know where you came from." The egg represents the future. The backward gaze represents the wisdom of the past. The forward flight represents progress. These three ideas, past, future, progress, in one visual form. One image. The most elegant statement of historical consciousness I have ever encountered. On the global spread, Adinkra symbols are now found on everything from luxury fashion accessories to corporate logos to government buildings. Some of this appropriation is credited. Ghana's coat of arms includes Adinkra elements. Much of it is not. The aesthetic appeal of Adinkra symbols is immediately evident to any viewer from any culture, because these symbols were designed to communicate visually across barriers. They worked in the 13th century, and they work in the 21st century. That is the mark of a truly great visual language. Now take a few minutes to answer this question. Which Adinkra symbol most resonates with you? Comment the name or just describe it. Sankofa, Gyenyame, Funtumfunafu. Let's map what people connect with most. When the Ife bronze heads were first studied by European scholars in 1910, the leading art historian of the day, Leo Frobenius, declared that they must be the remnants of a sunken Atlantis. Not because there was any evidence for Atlantis in Yorubaland, but because the naturalistic perfection of the portraits was, in his mind, impossible for Africans to have produced. He was wrong. The Ife heads were made by Yoruba specialists, using techniques developed independently of any European influence. They date to between the 11th and 15th centuries. They represent a tradition of royal portraiture of extraordinary sophistication that had no equivalent in Europe at the same time. The history of African art is largely the history of European scholars refusing to believe what they were looking at, and then scrambling to attribute African achievement to any external source. This pattern, which has been documented and named diffusionism, is the intellectual equivalent of Picasso's appropriation, taking the achievement and refusing to credit the source. On Ella Natsui. Ella Natsui is the bridge figure in this slide, from ancient tradition to contemporary global art market. His installations, made from thousands of discarded liquor bottle caps wired together, sell for millions of dollars at auction. They hang in MoMA, the Tate Modern, the Royal Academy. They are simultaneously celebrations of African aesthetic tradition, the strip-woven textile aesthetic, critiques of colonial commodity economics, the liquor bottles, and demonstrations that the African aesthetic vocabulary is globally powerful at the highest level of the contemporary art world. He is Ghanaian. He teaches in Nigeria. He is not based in London or New York. He is doing it from the continent. On the trance art interpretation. The sand trance art interpretation is one of the most important breakthroughs in art history of the 20th century, and it came from actually listening to the people whose tradition it was. For 100 years, researchers looked at sand rock paintings and described what they saw: animals, hunting scenes, human figures. They interpreted them as hunting magic, as proto-writing, as territorial marking. None of these interpretations had been tested against sand testimony. Then in the 1980s, David Lewis Williams and Thomas Dowson did something radical. They conducted extensive interviews with living sand healers and recorded their descriptions of the healing trance experience. They then compared the descriptions with the painted images. The match was extraordinary. The therianthropic figures, part human, part animal, are healers in the process of transforming during the trance. The rows of dots and zigzag lines are descriptions of visual phosphenes, the geometric hallucinations that appeared during trance states, now documented by neuroscience. The elongated figures represent the sensation of bodily transformation that healers describe. The underwater scenes represent the feeling of passing through the veil between worlds. In other words, sand rock art is a 30,000-year-old visual neuroscience experiment. The painters were documenting consciousness states with extraordinary accuracy. And we only understood this when we stopped assuming we knew more than the people who made it. On Los Gil, Somalia has one of the most extraordinary undiscovered rock art sites in the world. In 2002, a French archaeological team found paintings at Los Gil, near Hargeisa, that are among the best preserved anywhere in Africa, vibrant colors after 9,000 years. Political instability has prevented comprehensive documentation. Much of this extraordinary human heritage is at risk. In Western art traditions, the body is a subject of art, something you look at and paint or sculpt. In many African traditions, the body is the art medium, something you decorate, modify, and inscribe as an ongoing artistic practice across a lifetime. The distinction matters because it completely changes the relationship between artist, subject, audience, and meaning. On Maasai beadwork as language, I want to be very precise about Maasai beadwork because it is frequently discussed as jewelry, a Western category that completely misses its function. Maasai beadwork is a communication system. Each color in the established color vocabulary carries specific meaning. Red equals blood, warrior status. Blue equals sky, water. White equals purity, cattle. Orange equals hospitality. Green equals land, grass. Yellow equals fertility. The configurations of colors in specific patterns communicate specific information. A woman wearing a wide beaded collar, Nkerewa, communicates her age grade. The number of strands communicates something about her children. The specific patterns communicate her regional affiliation. A trained Maasai reader, every Maasai is a trained reader, can decode all of this information in seconds. The jewelry is not decorative. It is textual. The woman is wearing a page of biography. On Dinka aesthetic. The Dinka cattle camp aesthetic, young men in elaborate body adornment, carrying spears, making elaborate poses, has become one of the most photographed aesthetic traditions in Africa. The photographer Mario Testino spent time with Dinka communities, and his photographs directly influenced runway fashion photography in the 2000s. The irony. One of the world's most commercially valuable aesthetic traditions belongs to a community that the fashion world exploited without compensation or credit. Again, the Great Mosque of Djenné is, in my view, one of the most extraordinary works of architecture in the world. It is built from sun-dried mud bricks plastered with mud. It requires complete replastering every year after the rainy season. This replastering, the crepissage, happens as a community festival. The entire town participates. Young men climb the mosque's built-in wooden scaffolding, the torons that protrude from the facade, and apply fresh plaster handed up by teams below. Musicians play. Spectators watch. The repair of the mosque is an annual celebration. What this means is that the building literally cannot exist without the community. It is architecturally codependent with the people it serves. This is not a design flaw. It is the architectural equivalent of Ubuntu. The mosque endures because the community endures. The community endures because maintaining the mosque is what they do together every year. Art and community are inseparable. On Great Zimbabwe again. I return to Great Zimbabwe because the colonial denial of its origins is such a perfect illustration of the problem we've been discussing throughout this video. Here is what happened. European explorers find extraordinary dry stone architecture in southern Africa. Their immediate response, before any investigation, before any consultation with local populations, is denial. This cannot be African. It must be Phoenician. It must be Sheba. It must be anything other than what it obviously is, Shona. The Rhodesian government then made it official policy, in law, to suppress evidence of Shona authorship of Great Zimbabwe. Researchers who published evidence that Africans built it were threatened. This was not in the distant past. This was the 1970s. The law was only overturned when Zimbabwe gained independence in 1980. Great Zimbabwe is one of the most beautiful buildings ever made. It is African. It is Shona. It always was. On blacksmithing. In many West African cultures, blacksmiths occupy a special social position that is simultaneously high status and marginal. They are specialists who perform a kind of alchemy that other community members cannot and should not do. The transformation of raw ore into metal was understood as a dangerous, sacred process. The blacksmith mediates between the raw forces of the earth and the refined needs of the community. This mediating role makes them simultaneously feared, respected, and sometimes set apart, required to live in separate neighborhoods, to intermarry only within their caste. The objects they produce, tools, weapons, jewelry, ritual implements, carry the residue of this sacred process. A Dogon blacksmith's iron altar, Binu altar, is considered spiritually potent not just because of what it represents, but because of who made it and how. The object's power comes from its maker's relationship to the transformation process. On Rwandan basketry, the Rwandan coiled basket, agaseke, is one of the most mathematically complex geometric art forms in the world. The patterns, called imigongo when they appear on painted walls, use a grid-based system with no horizontal or vertical lines, creating spiraling diagonal patterns of extraordinary intricacy. These patterns were traditionally made by elite women in the royal court. UNESCO recognized them. They now form the basis of a significant craft industry that employs hundreds of thousands of Rwandan women. Indigenous art tradition as economic development. That is African art in the 21st century. Of these four forms, metalwork, pottery, basketry, wood carving, which do you think is most globally underappreciated? Comment your pick. If you are serious about Africa's future, you must also become serious about personal growth, execution, discipline, entrepreneurship, and building. Knowledge without implementation changes nothing. That is exactly why I'm building the Griot Wave Inner Circle, an execution-focused community for builders, creators, entrepreneurs, and purpose-driven individuals. A space focused on accountability, implementation, entrepreneurship, transformation, AI and digital leverage, community, and real progress. Weekly live sessions, execution systems, focused builders, real conversations, real growth. If you are tired of consuming endlessly and ready to start building intentionally, scan the QR code or use the link below to join the early interest list. Stop consuming, start building. Don't build alone. Join the Griot Wave Inner Circle and connect with a community focused on real execution and transformation. Scan the QR code to begin. 4 times in human history, a human community looked at the problem of recording knowledge and invented writing from scratch. Not borrowed it, not adapted it, invented it from nothing, independently, by observing that marks can carry consistent meaning across time and distance. Sumerian cuneiform, approximately 3500 BCE. Chinese oracle bone script, approximately 1250 BCE. Mayan hieroglyphs, approximately 250 BCE. And Nsibidi, date uncertain but predating European contact in southeast Nigeria. One of the 4. African. On the Ekpe Society. Nsibidi is not a public script. It belongs to the Ekpe, leopard, secret society, one of the most powerful judicial and commercial governance institutions in the Cross River region. The Ekpe Society's authority extends across multiple ethnic groups, operating as a kind of supranational legal system. Nsibidi documents their decisions, and only initiates can read them. The deliberate exclusivity of the script is part of its power. Knowledge that is freely available is worth less as a governance tool than knowledge restricted to those who have proven their commitment through initiation. On the Cuba connection. This is one of the most extraordinary stories in the history of writing. Enslaved people from the Calabar coast, Efik, Ijigam, Igbo, brought to Cuba in the 18th and 19th centuries, formed the Abacua Fraternal Society. In establishing this society, they reconstituted their initiation system, their drum tradition, their ceremonial practices, and their writing. The Anafuruana script used in Abacua ceremonies derives directly from Nsibidi. A West African writing system survived the Middle Passage and was reconstituted in Cuba. It is still in use today. That is the resilience of African art and knowledge traditions. African storytelling has never been limited to words alone. Across the continent, stories have been carved into bronze, painted onto walls and everyday objects, woven into textiles, sung by griots, and illuminated in manuscripts. The famous Benin bronzes recorded history just as a written chronicle would. Ghanaian proverb art transformed wisdom into images that communities could instantly understand. Ethiopian manuscript traditions preserved centuries of narrative through vibrant visual storytelling. And throughout it all, the griot remained a living archive, combining voice, music, gesture, and memory. In Africa, art and storytelling are inseparable. Every image tells a story, and every story leaves an image in the mind. Across many African societies, royal art was never merely decorative. It was political power made visible. The golden stool of the Asante was believed to embody the soul of the nation, so sacred that a war was fought to protect it. The royal tapestries of Dahomey recorded history, victories, and legitimacy in fabric, serving as visual declarations of sovereignty. Among the Zulu, beadwork communicated status, relationships, and political meaning through a sophisticated visual language. And in Yoruba tradition, the king's crown did more than symbolize authority. It transformed the wearer into the living embodiment of sacred kingship. These objects were not just symbols of power. They were instruments through which power, identity, and collective memory were expressed and sustained. This slide tells a story that is often missing from mainstream art history. The rise of Western modernism did not happen in isolation. Many of its most celebrated innovations were inspired by African artistic traditions. Picasso's move toward Cubism followed his encounter with African masks and sculpture. Matisse drew heavily from North African color, pattern, and decorative forms. Modigliani's iconic portraits echo West African sculptural aesthetics, while Brancusi's simplified forms reflect principles long present in African sculpture, capturing essence rather than surface appearance. This is not about claiming that these artists simply copied African art. It is about recognizing that African creators helped transform the visual language of the 20th century. The challenge is that the influence was often acknowledged privately, but minimized publicly, leaving African contributions underrepresented in the story of modern art. Today, scholars are increasingly restoring that missing context. When we look at Cubism, Expressionism, and modern sculpture, we are not only seeing European innovation, we are also seeing the global impact of African artistic genius. The full story of modernism is not a European story alone. It is a shared story, and Africa is one of its essential authors. This slide highlights one of the most important debates in the world of art and cultural heritage today: who should possess Africa's historical treasures? During the colonial era, thousands of African artworks, sacred objects, manuscripts, and royal regalia were removed from their communities and dispersed across museums in Europe and North America. Institutions such as the British Museum, the Quay Branly Museum, and others now hold collections that are central to African history and identity. What makes this issue complex is that it is not only about ownership, it is about memory, justice, and cultural continuity. Some museums argue they are protecting a shared global heritage, while others have begun acknowledging that many objects were acquired under conditions of conquest, coercion, or unequal power. In recent years, Germany, the Smithsonian, and several other institutions have taken significant steps toward repatriation, returning important artifacts to their countries of origin. The key question is no longer whether these objects matter. Everyone agrees they do. The question is how the world should balance preservation, access, and historical justice. As museums, governments, and communities continue this conversation, one thing is clear. These objects are more than artworks. They are pieces of living history, carrying the stories, identities, and memories of the people who created them. For much of the 20th century, African art was often discussed as an influence on global art. Today, African artists are not simply influencing the market, they are helping define it. Artists such as El Anatsui, Njideka Akunyili Crosby, Lynette Yadam-Balakie, William Kentridge, and Kader Atia are commanding international attention, major exhibitions, and record-breaking sales, while remaining deeply connected to African histories, identities, and experiences. What makes this moment significant is that these artists are not succeeding by imitating Western trends. They are bringing African perspectives, materials, stories, and philosophies into the global conversation on their own terms. Their work explores memory, identity, colonialism, repair, migration, and belonging, issues that resonate far beyond Africa. This is a remarkable historical shift. For centuries, African art was collected, classified, and interpreted by others. Today, African artists are increasingly shaping how their stories are told, how their work is valued, and how the world understands contemporary culture. The global art market is no longer simply looking at Africa. It is listening to Africa. Afrofuturism asks a powerful question. What if Africa's future was imagined from African perspectives, rather than through someone else's lens? It blends technology, science fiction, spirituality, history, and culture to envision futures rooted in African experiences and traditions. What makes Afrofuturism unique is that it does not reject the past, it carries the past into the future. Whether in Black Panther's Wakanda, the visionary art of Wangechi Mutu, the cosmic jazz philosophy of Sun Ra, or the science fiction worlds of Nnedi Okorafor, we see African aesthetics, myths, philosophies, and histories transformed into visions of tomorrow. At its heart, Afrofuturism is an act of creative sovereignty. It challenges the assumption that the future belongs to only a few cultures or regions. Instead, it declares that African stories, ideas, technologies, and imaginations belong at the center of humanity's future. It is not simply about predicting tomorrow. It is about reclaiming the right to imagine it. When people talk about Nollywood, they often focus on entertainment. But Nollywood is much more than a film industry. It is one of the largest projects of cultural self-representation in the modern world. Every year, thousands of films tell African stories through African voices, languages, values, and worldviews. What makes Nollywood remarkable is its scale and authenticity. Whether the story is told in Yoruba, Igbo, Hausa, Pidgin, or English, it reflects local realities, cultural traditions, family structures, spiritual beliefs, and social challenges. These are not outsiders interpreting Africa. They are Africans telling their own stories. With audiences numbering in the hundreds of millions and growing global investment from platforms like Netflix, Nollywood has become a powerful cultural force. It demonstrates that African visual storytelling is not a niche market or a regional phenomenon. It is a global industry shaping how Africa sees itself and how the world sees Africa. In many ways, Nollywood is the modern continuation of the storyteller's role, using film instead of the fireside, but still carrying culture, memory, identity, and imagination to the next generation. Today, some of the most influential ambassadors of African visual culture are not found in museums. They are found in music videos, fashion shows, and global entertainment. Through artists like Beyoncé, Burna Boy, and Wizkid, millions of people are encountering African aesthetics, symbols, fabrics, colors, and design traditions, often without realizing it. What is remarkable is that these visuals are not being presented as historical artifacts or cultural curiosities. They are being presented as contemporary, aspirational, and globally relevant. Adinkra symbols, Yoruba design traditions, Maasai beadwork, Ankara textiles, and Lagos street aesthetics are becoming part of the global visual vocabulary. This represents a major shift in cultural influence. For generations, African art was often displayed behind glass, interpreted by others. Today, African visual traditions are moving through music, fashion, film, and digital media directly to global audiences. The runway becomes a gallery. The music video becomes an exhibition space. The artist becomes a cultural curator. What we're witnessing is not simply entertainment. It is African visual culture asserting itself on the world stage, confidently, creatively, and on its own terms. Throughout history, African art has often been misunderstood, misclassified, or deliberately diminished. This slide challenges 5 of the most persistent myths. African art is not primitive. It includes some of the world's oldest known artistic traditions and highly sophisticated technologies, from bronze casting to monumental architecture. It has always had master artists, even when Western scholars failed to record their names. It is not static. It has constantly evolved, adapted, and innovated across centuries. Perhaps most importantly, African art is far more than decoration. It carries philosophy, history, spirituality, governance, memory, and identity. To understand many African artworks, you must understand the cultural knowledge they encode. What appears simple often contains layers of meaning invisible to those outside the tradition. And finally, the question of ownership remains central. Many of Africa's greatest treasures arrived in Western museums through colonial conquest and extraction, not through equal exchange. Understanding that history is essential to understanding the collections themselves. The deeper lesson is this. The problem was never African art. The problem was often the lens through which it was viewed. As that lens changes, a richer, more accurate story is finally emerging. One of the biggest challenges when viewing African art is learning to ask different questions. In many museums, we're trained to focus on beauty, style, or age. But African art often demands something deeper. Instead of asking, is it beautiful? Ask, what is it for? Was it created for a ceremony, a royal court, a healing ritual, or community governance? Function often unlocks meaning. Next, ask who made it and for whom. Many objects were created by highly skilled specialists for specific audiences and purposes. Every color, pattern, material, and form may be communicating something. African art is often a language as much as it is an object. Equally important is asking what is missing. Museum labels can tell us where an object is today, but not always the full story of how it was used, what it meant, or how it arrived there. Ultimately, African art invites us to move beyond passive viewing. It asks us to become investigators, interpreters, and listeners. When we do, we discover that these objects are not silent. They are speaking. The question is whether we know how to hear them. This final idea invites us to think about influence, recognition, and historical memory. Across art, music, fashion, design, and popular culture, African creativity has shaped global culture in profound ways. The visual language that helped fuel modernism, the rhythms that underpin much of global music, the textile patterns that inspire fashion houses, and the symbolic systems that influence modern design all carry African contributions. The point is not to deny the creativity of others, but to recognize that innovation rarely happens in isolation. Cultural exchange is part of human history. The challenge arises when some contributions are celebrated, monetized, and remembered, while others are overlooked, uncredited, or disconnected from their origins. Today, we are witnessing a gradual correction. African artists, designers, musicians, and scholars are increasingly receiving the visibility and recognition they deserve. Yet this is not simply about market value or prestige. It is about telling a fuller and more honest story of how global culture was built. Perhaps the most important takeaway from this entire presentation is this: Africa has never been on the margins of world culture. It has been one of its great engines of creativity, imagination, and innovation. The more accurately we understand that history, the more accurately we understand the world itself. As we conclude this journey through African art, remember that what we've explored today is only the beginning. African art is not a single style, period, or region. It is one of the world's most diverse and continuous creative traditions, stretching from prehistoric rock art to contemporary galleries, from sacred masks to digital Afrofuturism. The books listed here provide deeper historical, philosophical, and cultural context. The films and documentaries bring these stories to life through powerful visual storytelling. And the museums, fairs, and learning platforms offer opportunities to engage directly with artists, collections, and ongoing conversations shaping the future of African art. Perhaps the most important lesson is this: African art is not a footnote to world art history. It is a central chapter in the human story of creativity. To study African art is to study innovation, memory, spirituality, identity, resistance, beauty, and imagination across thousands of years. The more deeply we explore it, the more we discover that African art is not only about understanding Africa, it is about understanding humanity itself. Knowledge becomes meaningful when it leads to action. Throughout this presentation, we've explored the depth, complexity, and global influence of African art. The question now is, what do we do with that knowledge? The good news is that engaging with African art doesn't require a degree in art history. It can begin with something as simple as learning an Adinkra symbol, following a contemporary African artist, or watching a documentary. Each small step expands your understanding of the visual languages that have shaped cultures for centuries. As you go deeper, you can support living artists, ask better questions in museums, learn the story behind the Benin bronzes, and participate in conversations about preservation, ownership, and representation. African art is not a closed chapter of history. It is a living, evolving tradition being created right now. The most important takeaway is this: don't remain a spectator. Become a participant. Learn, support, share, question, and engage. The future of African art will not be shaped only by artists and institutions, but by people who choose to see it, value it, and carry its stories forward. As we close this journey, I invite you to rethink African art, not as a regional tradition, but as one of humanity's great creative achievements. For over 30,000 years, African artists have carved, painted, woven, cast, designed, and imagined worlds into existence. Their work preserved history, transmitted philosophy, expressed spirituality, and shaped identity long before many modern institutions existed. We have seen how African art influenced modernism, inspired global music and fashion, survived displacement, and continues to evolve through contemporary artists, Nollywood, and Afrofuturism. This is not a story of the past. It is a living tradition that continues to shape the present and imagine the future. If there is one message to take away, it is this: African art is not important because it influenced others. It is important because it is a profound expression of human creativity in its own right. The more we understand it, the more we understand the richness of human civilization itself. The story of African art is still being written. The question is whether we will choose to see it, study it, support it, and pass it on. Thank you. Before you go, help this message reach more people. If you learned something new today, like the video, subscribe for more deep dives, and share this with someone who still thinks Africa is a country. Small conversations can challenge big misconceptions, and every share helps expand understanding. If you want to explore this topic further, scan the QR code for additional resources, courses, recommended readings, maps, and extended discussions. There is far more to Africa than what can fit into a single episode, and this is only the beginning of a much deeper journey into the continent's history, cultures, people, and future. And if you'd like a deeper dive into any topic related to Africa or Pan-Africanism, leave a comment below and we'll cover it in a future video.